I know the Stoics probably wouldn't want to do that too often.
I like that. That's a very good idea. I'll try to remember that as a Stoic philosophical technique.
Yes. Today we're going to have breakfast with Seneca, or at least with Seneca's letters, where he very helpfully explains many of the most important and practical elements of Stoicism. Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today I'm talking with David Fideler, a college professor, editor, and publisher, and the director of a humanities center. He is the editor of the Stoic Insights website and author of Breakfast with Seneca, a Stoic guide to the art of living, of which we will be speaking about today. But before we begin, a quick note to say that Classical Wisdom Society members can listen to the entire podcast with David Fideler on classicalwisdom.com. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now, for Breakfast with Seneca. And so why did you pick these letters specifically?
Well, actually, what I did was I covered all of Seneca's writings, the letters, and his other philosophical works. But the background story, most people are more familiar with the letters than his other works, but they all fit together really because he's expressing his philosophy in all of these works. But the letters were written to a friend of his, Lucilius, who was the governor of Sicily. And he was about 10 years older than Seneca and was having what we would today call a midlife crisis. He had achieved fame, fortune, and status, but he found public life to be unfulfilling and wanted to retire and lead a more philosophical life. So he turned to Seneca as a philosophical mentor. And so Seneca is helping Lucilius to make progress on the philosophical path and also deal with some of his neurotic symptoms, which seem to be quite plentiful. And one of the things to really keep in mind, though, about the letters is that Seneca saw Stoicism as a path on which you would make philosophical and psychological and moral progress. And so progress is one of the most frequently used terms and concepts in the letters. And actually, the name of a student of Stoicism in ancient Greek was prokopton, which means someone who is making progress.
I like that idea of progress. And also, it's always interesting to note that in the ancient times, as well as in our modern times, we have these goals that we think we'll get to and we accomplish, and then we'll find happiness. But it doesn't actually work that way. Often, usually when people get to the point when they accomplish what they want, they find that was not as fulfilling as that they had hoped, and that actually we have to find meaning in more deep philosophical concepts.
Right. Seneca said that basically most value in human life exists in the present moment, and that if you can't find value in the present moment, you're looking at the world in a incorrect way. And a lot of people become anxious because they're totally concerned about the future and they start worrying about it, whereas real fulfillment is found in the here and now. It's not like actually getting somewhere. But the idea of progress, it is sort of a metaphor for travel in a sense, but it really refers to developing a better character over time.
Yeah, can I just say my little trick for being present? And this isn't a very Stoic thing to say, maybe, but is cheersing. Whenever you're cheersing and you're having a drink with your friends or your family or whatnot, that moment when you're cheersing is exactly about being present, marking the moment of right now, acknowledging it, and everybody being aware that you're right there. Now, I know the Stoics probably wouldn't want to do that too often.
I like that. That's a very good idea. I'll try to remember that as a Stoic philosophical technique. So,
Yes, yes,
no, it's so good.
the progress of choosing. Oh, well, that might be a little bit harder. So you're saying about progress. What are some other really important Stoic practices do you think that can help people today, that can help them find their own sense of progress?
Well, actually, Seneca's letters, they're all really about applied ethics. So I think what Seneca would say is that really all the material in the book is supposed to be applicable. It's something that you can apply. And at least in the way that I look at Seneca, I'd say the most important material relates to the fact that he was what I call a proto-psychologist. And he uses all these psychological ideas. He was way ahead of his time. So he's using all these ideas that didn't even have names until the last century. And the Stoics invented what we now call the cognitive theory of emotion. And that's the idea that most of our emotions are based on mental judgments or opinions. And the famous saying about that is it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about things. And in the book, I give an example of, imagine like it's a rainy day and you're walking along the road and there's like a big puddle, and then a car comes by and hits the puddle and splashes you and you get all wet. Well, the way that someone will react to that will depend actually on the opinion that they have of the event. So someone might say, oh my God, you ruined my entire day, and then become very angry and want revenge on the driver. Whereas someone else might just say, oh, I got splashed, maybe I need a towel. So it's really the judgments or the opinions that we have about a lot of events that generate our emotional responses. And about 20% of the people in the United States suffer from anxiety. And Seneca wrote a lot about how to overcome worry and anxiety. That's something covered in the book. And also he wrote an entire book on how to stop anger from occurring.
To bring it back to Seneca, Seneca is a really interesting character. And I've done a lot of work with James Romm over the years, and he wrote Dying Every Day, Seneca and the Court of Nero. And we had an interesting conversation too about how Seneca, was only kind of a Stoic in a way. I mean, there's sometimes where you want to do what he says more than what he does.
In the ancient world, Seneca was attacked as being a hypocrite because he was one of the wealthiest people in the ancient world. And someone thought that it was hypocritical for a Stoic to be wealthy. That's actually not the case. And it was something that Seneca refuted in one of his essays. And I think one of the problems about interpreting Seneca's life is that there are no direct firsthand accounts about Seneca that survive from anyone that actually knew him personally. And as you know, the two main sources we have, there's some material in the annals of Tacitus, which appeared, a few decades after Seneca had died. And there's an incredibly unreliable account from Dio Cassius, written around 150 years after Seneca had died. And it's not at all clear what kind of source material they were drawing on. In fact, some of the claims made in these stories are incredibly far-fetched. For example, that Nero's mother seduced Nero and slept with him, and Nero's mother slept with Seneca, and that Seneca owned 500 tables made out of fine wood and ivory for throwing wild parties and things like that. I don't find those things to be too believable. I don't even think that Bill Gates has like 500 tables for throwing parties. So you have to look at a lot of these things. Now some of the stuff they wrote about is true, because Nero did kill his mother and brother and, engaged in a lot of bad behavior. But a lot of these things are just stories, and we don't really have any way to judge them. So this goes back to the Stoic principle of suspending judgment when you're unsure of the facts. So I think that anyone associated with Nero, say like Seneca, would have suffered some, moral harm from it, but that would have applied also to Caligula and Claudius as well. And, if you had, worked closely with them in any way. And when Seneca became Nero's tutor, Nero was only 11 years old. So Seneca had no idea what Nero would turn into in the future. And then when Nero started to become murderous and things like that, I think it was very hard for Seneca to pull out at that point. And to judge whether a person is good or not, from a Stoic perspective, it depends on the person's intentions. So if Seneca had the intention of trying to make Nero better in some sense, or at least make him less dangerous, then continuing to stay with Nero would have been like a virtuous decision. In the end, of course, Nero ended up killing Seneca because he ended up killing everyone around him, basically. But
oh, Nero!
One thing that
Nero did.
Yeah, one thing I really want to stress, though, is that a lot of these ancient Roman histories aren't that accurate, and they draw on sources. Sometimes they give the sources, but sometimes they don't. And that the first modern history was only written in the 1400s by Leonardo Bruni, who is someone that our friend Alexandra Hudson knows a lot about. He wrote The History of the Florentine People, and what makes that modern is he critically analyzed the nature and accuracy of the sources he was using, and that just didn't happen in the ancient world. And I see a lot of people like drawing on these stories of philosophers, like from Diogenes Laertius, and they have no idea when Diogenes Laertius even lived. And he lived probably a little after the time of Marcus Aurelius. So that means like any stories about the Stoics or earlier philosophers are basically like at least 500 years old.
I did a children's book on Sappho, and it's interesting because a lot of the information about Sappho, I mean, it's really far back, but a lot of times it goes to the Suda, which is not a very reliable source at all.
Right.
And so, and many of the things that people say about Sappho are like at least 300 years after her death.
Exactly,
so,
right.
It's
right.
really hard to know, and people are very quick to say she's like X, Y, or Z, and you're like, oh,
right.
That's much harder to.
See, we modern people, we're used to reading histories, right? And it's very different when you read these ancient works, because a lot of them are just stories, and they're collections of stories that people have compiled, and they have no idea what stories.
We're releasing today the next podcast, so by the time this podcast comes out, it will have been in the past. But it's on the myth of Atlantis with Angie Hobbs, and that is the spoiler alert is part of the whole conversation about people want to find the history of Atlantis, but really it's Plato using it as a myth, as an allegory to teach a story.
Yes.
So just to finish up with a more lighthearted question, what do you think breakfast with Seneca really would have been like?
If I could have a breakfast with Seneca now. So if I could have breakfast with Seneca now, I probably wouldn't talk to him about philosophy, because I think that he actually did a very good job of communicating his philosophy in his written works, and probably said everything that he had to say. But I would ask him, what was it like for him personally to psychologically be in the vicinity of Nero, and why did he stay on? Because that is something he does not address. He sort of had a policy about that. I mean, if you read between the lines, you can see potential criticisms of Nero where he's talking about, people who had just excess wealth, and you could like read them as being references to what Nero's golden house that he built and things like that. But the other thing I would really be interested in asking Seneca about is he had a lung condition all his life. It seemed to be a mixture of like tuberculosis and asthma. And when he was 25, he went to live with his aunt in Alexandria because the air was better there than in Rome. He was there for 10 years, and we don't have a single piece of information about what he did in Alexandria in Egypt for 10 years. It's just like a blank part of his life. So I think it'd be really interesting to say, hey, Seneca, what did you do for 10 years when you were in Alexandria?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I like that. The missing chapter.
Well, now, there's a historical novel for you. Someone could write a historical novel about that.
Well, I'm always holding out. We're still finding really amazing archaeological finds, especially in Egyptian trash heaps. And there's still actually, thousands of works that have not gone through critical translation. So you never know. We might still find out.
It's possible, yes. Yeah, there are a lot of treasures possibly lurking in the trash that someone will find and translate.
Well, thank you so much, David. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm going to put links to Breakfast with Seneca below so everyone can learn more about Stoicism, about Seneca, and make their daily routine, their breakfast, a little bit more philosophical.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It's been great speaking with you.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Classical Wisdom Society members can listen to the entire podcast with David Fideler on classicalwisdom.com. You can purchase David's book, Breakfast with Seneca, a Stoic guide to the art of living, on Amazon.